Good afternoon, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues. Thank you all for coming on this lovely day and join us for this presentation today. Welcome to the Center on International Cooperation at NYU, and a warm welcome for those who are following our live stream. I am Thibaut Cameli, and I will be your moderator today. Last week, as you all know, the presidents of the General Assembly and the Security Council officially launched the process that will lead to the selection and appointment of the next Secretary General. In this early stage, there are a number of questions on the process. And so in the course of the next 75 minutes, more or less, we will be navigating this process and address what you need to know to engage. To begin with, allow me to pass the floor to my colleague Betty Wainaina, Program Director here at CIC for Defending and Promoting Multilateralism.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a lovely day, and so nice to see so many friends who've come to join us in this conversation. Welcome so much to this event. Your Excellency, Ambassador Matu Joini, PR of South Africa to the United Nations, Excellency Ambassador Rain Tamzar, the PR for Estonia, other Excellency ambassadors that are present, distinguished panelists, and fellow colleagues. On behalf of Norway and the Center on International Cooperation at New York University, I wish to warmly welcome you to today's event on navigating the process recently launched, as Thibaut has so reminded us, leading up to the selection of the next United Nations Secretary General. My name is Betty Wainaina, and I'm the Program Officer for the Multilateral Reform Program here at CIC. CIC is a policy research center working to strengthen international cooperation, to prevent crisis and advance peace, justice, and inclusion. Our mission is to bring together policymakers, scholars, practitioners to generate practical ideas that respond to today's most complex global challenges. The Multilateral Reform Program, which I lead, seeks to advance policy solutions and ideas that can shape multilateral action and support multilateral institutions towards this goal. We do this through providing applied policy research and analytical briefs that can inform discourse, as well as convenings that are aimed at bridging cross-regional divides and promoting multi-stakeholder cross-fertilization of ideas. Our rallying call is that only through effective multilateralism can we address the myriad emerging global challenges and produce global public goods that benefit all equitably. The UN, as we all know, is a critical arena for advancing multilateral action. Through our project that is zeroing in on the UN at its 80th anniversary, we are engaging on a variety of issues facing the UN, seeking to advance ways in which the UN can reaffirm its relevance and legitimacy amidst the rapidly evolving landscape of today's global reality and the future world. To this end, we are following closely the Secretary General's UN80 initiative and the selection process of the next UN Secretary General, in addition to other more thematic issues such as financing for development and the global AI governance, amongst others. Selection of the next UN Secretary General cannot have come at a more critical time. At a time when the UN faces increasing pressure to justify its existence and prove its relevance. At a time when the institution is facing what is not new, but nonetheless one of the most significant liquidity challenges. At a time when global solidarity and trust as principles of international cooperation are not that obvious anymore. And at a time when we are reminded that inaction or insufficient action comes at a cost of great human suffering and loss of lives and threats to global stability. So even in the midst of all this, many in this room and around the world agree that if we did not have the UN today, we would create something akin to it. Because global cooperation is an imperative for the survival of humankind. Whilst we are all aware that member states' interest and geopolitics shapes the functioning and impact of the UN in very significant ways, there is recognition that the person who holds this office is very critical in shaping the nature of engagement, the visibility, the character, and the spirit of the organization. The joint letter issued recently by the Presidents of the General Assembly and Security Council reiterate and highlight the importance of this position. It is for this reason that the process that eventually selects this person needs to be able to do this in the most credible, inclusive, and transparent manner. Our preoccupation with the process is an acknowledgement that the end oftentimes influences the outcome. This process has come a long way, from one shrouded in opaqueness to one now that is more transparent, following the reforms of 2015 and 2021, and more recently, Resolution 79-327, that was adopted by the GA this year, further consolidates some of these reform issues and introduces new measures that we'll be hearing more about today. So what was totally a shut door became a small slit, and now is a door that is quarter open. It's not there yet, but it's better. How to strategically utilize and take advantage of the options that have been made available is the subject of the discourse we want to have today. I really look forward to the conversation and hope that these interactions allow us to forge complementary strategies that would serve to propel multilateralism forward. Thank you very much. Hand over back to Tigo.
Thank you very much, Betty, for framing the discussion today. And now let's get started and open that door that you were mentioning. We are honored today to have and to welcome Ambassador Rian Tamsar of Estonia and Ambassador Matujayini of South Africa. I would first like to welcome to the lectern Ambassador Tamsar. Ambassador Tamsar has been permanent representative of Estonia to the United Nations in New York since 2022. After a long career on strategic multilateral postings in the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 2020, as a member of the Security Council, Estonia joined the Accountability, Coherence and Transparency Group at the UN, a cross-regional coalition of small and mid-sized countries working together to improve the working methods of the Security Council. Following the principles of this group, Estonia, together with Costa Rica, led the process of making the last election of the UN Secretary General in 2021 more transparent and inclusive. Ambassador, thank you for joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I see that there is a certain interest towards this topic, so I'm very glad. Let me say a few words about Estonia's role indeed when it comes to the appointment, then a few words about the expectations for the 25-26 process, and I'll end up, as always, with a few words on selection criteria. And of course, for the start, many thanks for NYU Center on International Cooperation and Norway for organizing this really timely and important discussion. And indeed, as it was mentioned last week, just before Thanksgiving, we detected a white smoke coming from the chimneys of the Security Council and PGA's office. That meant that signatures were given to a joint letter formally kickstarting the selection process. And of course, I cannot escape commenting on the letter with your valuable permission. But let me start with Estonia's role in advocating for predictable, transparent and rule-based SG's appointments. Indeed, back in 2014, thanks to the persistent work of many member states and civil society organizations, I started to melt vis-a-vis the process that for 70 years had occurred behind closed doors and was not really merit-based. So until 2015, just to remind you, that selections of all previous Secretaries General were made without appointment criteria, without a call for nominations or for CVs, without a timeline for nominations, and without public hearings or other methods of public scrutiny at all. So as a member of Accountability, Coherence and Transparency Group, and internally together indeed with Costa Rica, we were in charge of so-called work stream on the selection of SG. So Estonia, but of course other members, active members of the group, pushed hard to elevate the role of General Assembly and the President of the General Assembly when it comes to the transparency and inclusiveness of the selection process. And just to recall that PGA back then, Morgan's Lukatoft, played an important role in this endeavor as well. So I would just recommend for those interested in details to dig into my predecessor's, Ambassador Jurgensen's letter to SG, PGA, and to a President of Security Council on lessons learned on the appointment of the 9th SG. The letter was sent on 9th of October 2017, which is actually quite relevant still. So in 2015-16, we achieved certain progress, undoubtedly. But I would say that there is still ample room to increase further transparency and inclusiveness of a process, to clear the timeline, definitely, to enhance the role of a General Assembly and PGA, and with the sole aim, frankly, to be able to select the best candidate for this job. There are plenty of ACT non-papers and public statements that I think are important in this regard. There is a role for civil society. We've seen some of very active members producing their own publications. One for 8 billion, for example, is the latest. And of course, Matu, you are here. Chapeau. The work that you did with my good friend, Ambassador of Romania, Cornel Fruta, I think was fantastic. So, but you know, what is the motivation behind Estonia's action? I mean, when we look around the current state of play of world affairs, wars and conflicts, I would say still diminishing political relevance of the UN in general. We need someone who would stop this, revert it, and would lead UN to a 21st century through reform and UN becoming really relevant. So now, when it comes to expectations for 25-26 process, first of all, I always remind that there is a role for General Assembly, and according to Charter, Article 97, the Security Council recommends, but the GA appoints the Secretary General. So we have a central role in this as a member states. Let's try to use it. And even more so because we've seen that Security Council has been paralyzed in important matters of security and peace in the past, and but also current. So on the letter itself, what is positive in this letter, in my view? The letter came out earlier than it was in 2015, so this allows, of course, more time, to deal with the process. Secondly, the letter was signed by E10 member, which was different in the past. Even if nothing else, this has, I would say, some symbolic role. The process is not owned by P5 only. So the letter contains some improvements. Let me mention a few. Encouragement of women candidates, importance of regional diversity. Candidates need to disclose source of their campaign funding. Those holding positions in the UN need to suspend their work. Procedure of withdrawal of candidates, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, as far as I understand, Cuisine Interne, E10 played a very important role in shaping this final letter. Where we need a further improvement, I would say, the letter is still a little bit ambiguous and of course on purpose. It leaves the door open for last-minute candidates. There is no cut-off date for nominating candidates. Reassuring candidates who do not participate in the interactive dialogues with member states that does not affect their chances of getting selected and appointed. Again, this leaves a door open for last-minute black horse candidates. While the letter is out to solicited candidates, there is still plenty of room for maneuver for PGA and General Assembly to improve the overall process. And the follow-up letter by the PGA testifies that, at least my reading is that she has a political will to do it. Now, when it comes to PGA, as noted, the process does not outline the deadline for the submission of the candidates. However, I would encourage, of course, PGA's office to start scheduling the interactive hearings with candidates as soon as possible, and include the deadline for the completion of the General Assembly hearings. This would encourage more candidates to come forward early, and this is our goal in this, I believe. There is also more to do to improve the format of open hearings. They need to be very interactive. We need to allow more time for candidates to respond, allow member states to ask additional questions, and of course PGA itself, at least theoretically, could be a good moderator for these discussions. Additional town hall meetings with civil society should be organized as it was in the past, but I think that this needs to be a little bit more interactive in its substance. We would also encourage PGA to be vocal in advocating for women candidates and emphasizing the importance of regional diversity, something that is important also for us. And with regard to the letter, let me be honest, with regard to the letter, the regional representation, if we fail second time in a row, then I think that it would be very difficult to legitimize in the future the entire argument for the regional rotation when it comes to the selection process. So we would rather try to make it right this time. And my advice to GROAC friends so far has always been, please, please, look on the process when Eastern European Group was supposed to get the SG. Do not repeat mistakes. Come up with a few solid, strong candidates and try to gather behind them. Then, of course, ACT Group itself encourages Security Council to present 2 or more candidates. And we also very strongly encourage General Assembly or PGA to conduct advisory voting to assess the level of support for candidates in the General Assembly. This was something that we suggested also for the resolution. It didn't pass, but this doesn't mean that this is something that we would easily abandon. I think it's a good idea. And of course, we also suggest General Assembly making final decision on the appointment, so to have additional hearing with a candidate or candidates already recommended by the Security Council. This is also something that we recommended for the resolution. Now, 3 short points on selection criteria, or expectations if you wish. The first, and I would say the most important, at least from my point of view, is that the candidates should have a proven, and I underline, impeccable track record in support of multilateralism, international law, and the purposes and principles of the Charter. Among the candidates who have been put forward already, in my personal, I underline personal view, not all are fully meeting this requirement. Secondly, I would give preference for an internationally recognized high-level politician, top political animal, if you wish, over bureaucrat or even UN administrator, because this role would need a really careful balancing between different forces who are shaping the world affairs at the moment. So it needs to be someone who would be familiar how to navigate there. And finally, collective discussions within the entire Security Council on the merit, skills and experience of a candidate should be really encouraged. And in closing, why does it matter? And I come back to what I said in the very beginning, that it is clear that the next SG will have one of the most difficult jobs, hopefully, in her hands. Transforming the UN to be fit for purpose in the 21st century, restoring the relevance and faith in the UN as a guardian of peace and security, and upholding all three pillars of the UN. All this requires very, very strong, experienced and principled political leadership. The process of selecting the new SG plays a critical part in finding one suitable for this, I would say, almost impossible job. But together, member states, other multi-stakeholder state, we can make it happen, I think, and we can at least try to make the process as transparent, as inclusive as possible this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for sharing your perspective, including your reading in between the lines of the letter, but also sharing your analysis of what needs to be taken into account going forward. As you mentioned, the General Assembly will have to play a significant role, and for that matter, I would like to call Ambassador Luini to give us her perspective. Ambassador, you are a permanent representative of South Africa to the United Nations in New York. Before that, you held senior positions in the South African Ministry of Foreign Affairs in different industries in the private sector, including mining, finance, petroleum, and consulting, if I'm not mistaken. As permanent representative at the UN, you have led numerous intergovernmental processes, including most recently as co-chair of the ad hoc working group on the revitalization of the work of the General Assembly, together with Romania. Under your leadership, revitalization improved and strengthened the process for selecting and appointing the next Secretary General, with improvements that will actually first come into force this cycle. Ambassador, thank you for joining us and for sharing your perspective.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and good afternoon, dear friends, dear colleagues, and the panel. I will probably do three things, and I wanted to touch on the context, but I think Betty has done justice to the context, so I will just touch a little bit on that, go on to the selection process itself, how we arrived at 79327, and then what I think we should proceed, how I think we should proceed to make sure that we appoint the most appropriate Secretary General to lead the United Nations. Just to start by saying, the selection process of an SG is not routine. It is in fact a defining moment for multilateralism and for the credibility of the organization. It is defining a moment, and it will prove the credibility of this organization. So Betty has given us the context. As I said, there's nothing for me to add there. The challenges that we are facing externally, the geopolitics, but also internally, the financial situation, and therefore the UN80 initiative. All of that meant is what this SG, as we select them, will have to deal with that context in the future. I am encouraged, though, many of us have probably looked at the current situation and said, where's the UN in this? When we see parallel processes, parallel initiatives that sometimes leave the UN out, have questioned the relevance of the UN.
But I was most encouraged by the high-level week when we saw our leaders, many of our leaders, go onto that rostrum, reconfirming and reaffirming the centrality of the United Nations, of the General Assembly, of multilateralism. And in fact, many of them even confirmed the support for the UN 8 initiative. So I believe that we stand on a strong foundation as we move forward, because we need to guard that narrow space that we have of multilateralism. And it is that narrow space that we have that will help us as we engage on the selection process. If we don't cooperate and work together on this, we might end up in a situation where we are steamrolled into the selection process of the new SG. So the selection process itself must be transparent, it must be credible, and it must be inclusive. And that's what myself and my colleague and dear friend, Ambassador Feruda, understood when we started the process and co-chaired the process on the revitalization of the work of the General Assembly. And here I wish to say to you, we were the vessels. We created the space for the discussions to happen. The output that you see in resolution 79327 is of some of the experts that I see in the room, the member states, the groups like ACT, and all that we have to do is to make sure that those ambitions, those ideas, the thoughts come through. And we had to create that environment for us to be able to engage. And some of you were in the room and saw how difficult it was to negotiate the process to make sure that at the end we codify a process that has got ambition, that we all believe in. For the co-chairs, we were very clear that we will drive a process that doesn't set us back. Often we said in the room, we will not preside over a process that, there's a regress on the previous resolution, on the previous process. And in fact, we were seeking to advance. We were seeking to mirror the ambition that we picked up as we were consulting different member states. So from the word go, we consulted very strongly with different member states. We consulted with the P5 individually. We sent out an invitation to consult with the E10. We consulted with, of course, other groups of member states to get the input. And those consultations resulted in the elements paper that we distributed. And I would encourage you to, if you really want to see the ambition of member states and the co-chairs, look no further than the elements paper and zero draft of resolution 79327. In there, you will find the issues that were raised by the ambassador of Estonia. So you will see that there the ambition was still there, the time frames were tighter. Not only did we say it starts here, it ends there, we were able to even give the dates. We had even given an indication that we want to start the process by the end of November. We specified a month. We were able to, in there, say you even need a phased approach, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. But of course we didn't succeed. You will remember that that zero draft has got a term, so we did look into a possibility of having one term that is not renewable but much longer. So we started off with 7-year term. We had much more clarity on the nomination process and on the withdrawal process. We had straw polls in the General Assembly, and we had elements there that pointed to transparency and inclusive participation, including there was wording on the inclusion of civil society. And there was recommendation, as you heard, of more than one candidate, and that when that recommendation comes, before finalization, there will be a hearing with the members of the General Assembly. While not all of these made it to the final resolution, but you would agree that the outcome, the final outcome, really has benefited a lot from what we got from member states, from the ambition that was demonstrated by member states. And it was simply the discussion in the room, the outcomes of the negotiations. And as I said, we had to, as two co-chairs, had to make sure that we give due consideration to all member states, including, and I always in the room talked about P4+1. Because again, you could pick up the nuances of the P4 and the 1. And we were quite open about that, and we really need to be in. You also need to read the selection process within the broader context of the resolution that we're looking at, the role and authority of the General Assembly. If there were two elements that were difficult during that time, is that part, the role and authority of the General Assembly, because it also talked to the selection process by the General Assembly together with the Security Council. In the end, we are satisfied with the outcome that we have. We believe that it has some elements that are improving on 335, and I also want to point out that in, I think it's in paragraph 39, you need to read that paragraph 39 of 327, because it indicates that all the principles that have been in the previous resolution, including 327, will apply. So this is where we captured all the principles that talk to transparency, that talk to inclusions. They were captured in paragraph 39. I will also encourage you to read step G, because step G opens up the space for the PGA to use the existing consultation process that we have, so that it's not constrained by the negotiations that we have been in the room, but allows the PGA to use the normal process where we engage with all stakeholders, including civil society. So it is in that step G, and that's what Rain was referring to. There's room for an opportunity for us to use fully paragraph G, as in the resolution. So the letter has gone out as agreed, and maybe before I go to the letter itself, just to say that something that we're satisfied with was the strong language on gender. And linked to that is the fact that overall in the resolution, in the working methods, we made sure, we were very clear from the outset that once and for all, we are going to have she, we are going to have her, we are going in the rules of procedure in anticipation that we want an election of a female Secretary General. But of course, we need to be neutral as co-chairs, but we were clear about one thing, that in the what we have control over is the working methods, together with colleagues, and that once and for all, this will change for the better. It can't be 8 years and you still just refer to, in your working methods, you still have he. And so we are happy that has changed. So the letter has now been issued. We must implement the codified process fully. And I must say that I was happy to see after the letter, there was another letter from the PGA. And if you read that carefully, she is making a statement that she is bound by resolution 79327, and she is bound to follow it fully. So read that her letter, because then it outlines that even if the issues are not captured in the letter, she's obliged to actually carry out the entire process in line with the resolution. Then lastly, I just want to comment on the leader that we need. We need a Secretary General that has vision, that has integrity, that has courage. Courage is going to be really needed. But operational excellence as well, because you still need to balance that. a person who can lead change. As you know, we are going through change with the UN. We want somebody that can lead change, deliver results, and in particular make sure that we deliver results on the ground where it matters, build bridges across divide, and importantly uphold the gender parity that we have and even make it better. We need to commit to a principled process and no shortcuts, no second best. And the letter begins to define the leadership profile, and we need to talk more and more about it as we move. And I would argue that we need to stay engaged. I was very pleased to see how many have become interested in this. And this is the one way that we can make sure that we have a credible process. By having spaces, by having rooms, by having platforms where we come together and engage on this. And not just member states, but member states and civil society. And in those rooms, invite the P5 so that they can hear what the will of the people is around the selection process. What I know is that the world is watching, not for rhetoric, but for resolve. And it is important that we rise to the occasion and deliver the leadership that the United Nations and the world deserves. I really think that this Secretary General is the soul of this organization, that they are the face of the organization, and it's going to be important that you and I are engaged in this process and use all opportunities that we can to make sure that the process is credible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for guiding us through the revitalization, all the insights, also your reading of what yet has to arrive and what yet has to come. Both of you highlighted how a process that was initially fairly closed gradually opened up through successive reform and incremental improvements. Ambassador Tamsar, you showed it from the perspective of the Security Council and the different improvements that you highlighted since 2015. Ambassador Joini, you've just run us through the improvements from the General Assembly perspective. Both of you highlighted the necessity to cooperate and work together in this gradually improved process, having shown what has been achieved, what yet has to be achieved, and the road ahead. For the member states to be able to elect someone, that's the most impossible job in the world, the face and soul of this organization. Now, let us dive deeper into this procedural framework and look into the selection process itself, ultimately asking ourselves the question, can an improved process produce a good leader? This segment will take the form of a dialogue between two key stakeholders who will share their insights on the ESG selections from the perspective of both the General Assembly and the Security Council. Our panelists today are Mina Syed and Lauren Sievers. Lauren needs no introduction. We all know her as Director of SC Procedure and co-author of the Procedure of the Security Council. She served as a full UN staff member for over 30 years, concluding her career as Chief of the Security Council's Secretariat Branch. Lauren, you were mentioning to me earlier before the beginning of this session that you've covered a fair number of those cycles. 10 of those cycles. So it's quite clear that your knowledge of the arcana of the Security Council procedures is unmatched, and you bring today a wealth of information for the specificities of the ESG selection. Mina, as UN Director for the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a position that you've held since 2023. Previously, you were at the United Nations in New York for over 12 years, on various postings, both at the permanent mission of Norway and the UN, including UN cabinet of the President of the General Assembly as a former senior official during the 70th and 71st sessions, and as such had an exceptional vantage point on the election of the SG in 2016. My colleague Fernando Marani will facilitate the discussion between you and confront your perspective. Fernando is Program Director of Justice, Inclusion and Equality at CIC, but most of you know him from his former duties and extensive UN experience, both at the Argentinian mission and as a senior official at the UPGA for the 75th to 78th session. Notably so as Chief Legal Advisor to the PGA in 2021, under which you had the privileged perspective on the SG reappointment. Fernando will guide us through the evolution of the process since 2015, the interactions between the Security Council and the General Assembly, and what that entails for the 2026 race. Mina, Lauren, Fernando, we are very eager to hear your thoughts. Over to you.
Thank you, Thibault. Yes, so let me see if you hear me. This mic. Hello? Hello, hello? Can try. I can stand there to work. I love standing, so it's no problem. And I'd rather have you hear me than sitting. So, so I thank you everyone for coming, and I'm really glad that there is a lot of interest to try to unpack the process of the selection and appointment. As Thibault mentioned, I was at the Argentinian mission in 2015. Argentina had a candidate at the time. Not to say that again, it's doing the same. But I remember being a new delegate and very struck about this process that was very unclear. There was a lot of traditions, but there was not a lot that we could get on how it will run. There was a lot of question mark. What is the next step? What is happening? Who is doing what? When we can get information? And I 10 years later, when we were discussing with my colleague, with Betty, it's like, maybe this is something that we can put together, like to bring people who actually knows about the process and can explain what is coming your way, how you can engage, how, like from the different roles that we have, from the civil society, from the public, but also from the member state side, because I think that this is, as many of the previous speakers say, this is the key moment for the organization. And process matters, like a good process can give you a good candidate. Also, the specificities of the process can provide you a specific profile for a candidate standing up. So that's a bit of the intention today. And Thibault mentioned 2015, that was the moment that the modern process of the SG selection took place. And it was not by chance, it had a lot of combinations of political will and a good momentum in international relations in general that opened the door slightly for few initial reforms. But so I want to maybe to start taking up to 2015 and walk all the way to where we are now, because yes, some of these rules were codified, some of these rules were reflected, but a lot happened outside of the formal rules. There was a lot of ambition based on the principles of inclusion and transparency that were put into place by different actors at different moments. So with that, I want to start with you, Mina. Take us back to 2015. What was that political momentum, and which were the key reforms that you managed to put through, both from the side of member state, but also from the side of PGA, that started this process of having a more transparent process.
Should I come? Yeah. Maybe will it stretch?
Yeah.
Just about.
Okay.
Perfect.
So, can you hear me? I can move also. Sorry, another one. So, thank you, and I'm coming at this from a vantage point that's actually quite interesting, because I had the privilege to be the team leader and responsible for the SG selection process during the 70th Mogens and also the 71st session with Peter Thompson as PGAs. And it was a time, as you know,
of great reform at the UN, especially pertaining to this process. And I came to that from being a Norwegian delegate very actively in the ACT group. And then I had the privilege 5 years later to sit as an elected member on the Security Council as political coordinator for Norway during the reappointment process. And of course, I've been following the GA revitalization process for the past 10 years in terms of codifying a lot of the practice that has been made. And I think it's really interesting to see at the point we are now where we are in terms of the joint letter, in terms of the procedure that is being spelled out in front of us. And I think it's worth remembering some of the struggles and the difficulties that we actually had framing this process. And a lot has been said about the context where we are now and the importance of the next Secretary General. And just to bring us back 10 years, where we were then, it was a time of also extremely dire international situation. 10 years with Ban Ki-moon as SG had brought a lot of momentum to both a call for the importance of who the next SG was, that this was going to be the chief diplomatic officer representing one for, at that time, 7 billion people. And also, I think a call for reform of a process that, as has been said, for 70 years had been held completely behind closed doors. And we were at a point where, you know, there had been no job description, no TOR, no official information about who were the candidates, no interviews, obviously, for the job, no formal opportunity for member states to actually interact with the candidates, no timeline, a repetition in this process, no start, no end, and everything was being done behind closed doors despite Article 97 of the Charter, which actually displays a joint role of the General Assembly and the Security Council in terms of the General Assembly appointing the Secretary General upon the recommendation of the Security Council, while the GA only had a symbolic role in terms of rubber stamping that decision. So that's where we came at it, and I would like to add 2015, many of you were probably here or somewhere around the world remembering it was a time where we had just adopted the SDGs. We had just adopted the Paris Climate Agreement and the Addis Ababa Action Plan on Financing for Development. That's how we came into the PGA's office of the 70th session. So it was a time of where multilateralism mattered a lot. And it was a time where the next SG was seen to be very important for the future of both the UN and the world. So where did we go from there in the PGA's office? We had been given a very unique mandate. The foundations had been laid in GA revitalization, and at that time the resolution was 69321. And it's interesting to see how those the numbers of the resolution seem to repeat themselves at the end of September every year, but that was the framework that we were given in terms of what to execute and framing this process. There was a strong mandate for the GA and the PGA to play a role in rebalancing the relationship between the Security Council and the GA, more in line with Article 97 of the Charter. There was a clear mandate in terms of the transparency and inclusivity that needed to guide this process. There were also, and I would stress the importance of civil society groups bringing this forward. One for 7 billion at the time has been mentioned. The elders were active. There were numerous individuals and global leaders that had spoken about the importance of this and the importance of many member states playing a crucial role in the GA revitalization process, obviously the ACT group, also the NAM group, and all of that had culminated into this mandate given precisely to the PGA to execute. And it was quite difficult, it was daunting, I would say, at the time to come into the role of shaping that process because there were a lot of expectations. There were also a lot of caution in terms of how to step forward and build that process. And I would say much is thanks to having such a bold and ambitious president of the General Assembly at the time, who saw this as his major role of actually executing this mandate that had been given to him. So we started out, I think, just to, we'll get back to some of your questions, but some things I wanted to mention, just because I see that there are repeating discussions that are coming up in this process, but to say that shaping, the joint letter as a first was the necessary start of that. We in the Office of the PGA took initiative to draft a first draft of that letter early in the fall of 2015, and worked with various Security Council presidents from September, October, November until December when the letter was signed. So a few things on the topics, or the things that got into the letter, which I'm pleased to see are there still today. Obviously, the references to transparency and inclusivity, the list of qualifications, and this was a sticking point for a long time because we had foreseen that the letter would be much more closer to a terms of reference, closer to sort of a call for nominations and a job description. And in the interaction between the Council and the PGA in terms of drafting that resolution, you've seen the result of what is there, but that, I think, still holds the standard in terms of what we expect, what is in the role of the Secretary General, the highest standards of efficiency, competence, integrity, proven leadership and managerial skills, etc., etc. You know what's there. We also tried pretty hard to push the gender dimension. We ended up with women as well as men, and I think there's actually a big step forward that has been made in the process since then that I'm happy to see, but it was specifically difficult to get language into the joint letter on that. Then on the informal dialogues, which I think became the major game changer in this process, for us it was actually important to maintain a lot of discretion for the PGA to shape that process and not prescribe too much in the joint letter and negotiate with all member states how that was done. That was a possibility we had because we had an ambitious PGA who actually wanted to push that agenda, and in the end and in hindsight, I think that was actually important because we set a precedent in terms of modalities for those informal dialogues and how they were held. Obviously, we tried hard to have a much clearer timeline. We had hoped to include some sort of a deadline for submission of candidates. We had hoped for a more sort of description of the process that was more detailed. It proved impossible. But in the end, an important point was to make sure that the timeline drew for the full part of the selection and appointment process. So there's this idea that, this process consists of the nomination process, the selection process, and the appointment process, and it interacts between the GA and the Security Council. So our point was to say the GA is actually relevant for the full process, which means that whenever there is a new candidate who comes along, and the risk would have been if we put a deadline, that candidates that came after would not feel that they had to come to the GA and could go directly to the Security Council. So an important point for us was to make modalities for the informal dialogues that could withstand the test of time and those three different parts of the process. So we can go into some of the details on the informal dialogues later, but I have to say it was a game changer in terms of how the process actually evolved. We had many that had the prediction before we started having these informal dialogues, or hearings as we call them, that they would prove to be irrelevant, that candidates would circumvent the General Assembly and go directly to the Council, and also very boring. So we had to prove them wrong, basically. There was also the expectation that latecomers would both circumvent and never feel the need to have a first step to come to the GA. The informal dialogues, nonetheless, proved to have the power of the openness and transparency of the process building the process. So there was, it became difficult for the council to overlook those hearings. And it was important for us from the PGA side to actually establish that those informal dialogues were the central piece of the hearings. Obviously, there were openings for the council to also have informal dialogues with the candidates, which were held. Again, we had that one in 2021 when the incumbent ran for re-election. But a point from the openness point of view was to have the GA hearings be the primary area of interaction with the candidates. When we shaped the modalities of the informal dialogues, we did a lot of consultations, but we made the decision in the PGA's office of how they needed to be. It was quite a comprehensive task because it had never been done before. We needed to make something that seemed fair and equal to all of the candidates. At the time, we had no idea how many candidates would come along or when, so we needed to make a modality that could be replicated several times up until the very end. We needed it to not drag on for hours, and it was said here, there certainly is scope to improve the modalities of those informal dialogues in terms of the interaction with the candidates. It was difficult to know. We had a time limit of 2 hours, and we set a time limit in terms of statements, but for sure the candidates could have gotten more time to actually reflect. We could have, we tried to have this interactivity between member states and civil society. Civil society participation in the informal dialogues was something that the PGA basically took as one of his biggest tasks. So we had interaction with the UN and GLS, who we built a full process in terms of how to get the wider global public actually interact. And so there was a dedicated civil society committee that received all the submission for and identified a short list of questions, and we made sure that they were not only at the end of the hearings but actually sort of interact or came in the middle of the member states' questions and were sort of had to be addressed as well by the candidates. The idea of a vision statement came from us as the PGA's office. There was nothing written in advance about that. And we thought in order to make these hearings as productive as possible, we challenged the candidates to actually come up with a vision statement that prescribed the challenges and opportunities facing the United Nations, that was circulated in advance so that the informal dialogues could be as interactive as possible and not a replication of actually performing that vision statement. We established the website, which I understand is now up again, and it was extremely important to be sort of the repository or have a place, a one-stop shop, so to say, where you could find information about the candidates, presentation of them, bios, vision statement, withdrawal letters, which came later, and also the live streamings of the hearings. Then we had an idea to do the town hall, which was not mandated at all, and we had to spend many, many days and hours planning, because it's not easy to actually have a first sort of live event broadcast debate from the GA hall. It had never been done before. And it proved really important. We had it in the summer at the time where I think 12 of the 13 candidates had been announced and participated, and just at the cusp of when the council was starting their straw polling. So that is also just goes to say that even though it wasn't mandated, it was something that was possible to do. And I know there's been, we've tried to codify parts of those actions later. But I have to say that the PGA at the time was very clear that he had a mandate, and then he pushed it further in order to make sure that this process was as optimal as possible. So I would say the momentum of all of these aspects created a very clear expectation from member states about what type of SG they wanted. So we said from the hearings, it was very clear for us that there was a desire to see a strong, independent, courageous Secretary General who would make the most out of his powers or her powers from the Charter. Then lastly, to say on the Security Council straw polls, we went back and looked, and I actually started working at the UN in 2005, so that was the selection of the SG when after Kofi Annan and before Ban Ki-moon. And we looked at the practice of the PGA in 2005, who was Jan Eliasson, who many of you will remember was PGA at the time. So the only actual role that the PGA had played in 2005 that we found was actually informing the GA of the start of the Security Council straw polls. That was like a big milestone of the PGA's interaction in that process. So we saw it as our role to actually nudge and push the Council in terms of the transparency and inclusivity that was guiding this process in terms of announcing and sharing the results of the straw poll. Obviously very difficult, obviously didn't happen. We used those monthly meetings that are held between the PGA and the President of the Security Council to actually nudge and try to use that as a vehicle of informing between the Council and the GA what was happening in this part of the process, which is very closed and within the Council. I think the interaction with E10 at this time was extremely important. Many of you will remember that those straw poll results were leaked very, very quickly from the Council, and so the argument that had been made by some of the Council members that it was important to preserve the dignity of the candidates and therefore not publish the results of the straw polls seemed contrary, because we ended up with, at times, erroneous results being leaked, and we didn't really think that preserved any dignity in terms of the process nor for the candidates. So that's certainly one of the points that still needs to be pushed for the process coming forward. And then I have a lot of outstanding issues that were not addressed then and have been tried to have been addressed in the years since. I won't go, I know I've gone over time, but just to mention the two key issues obviously was the issue of multiple candidates and also the single term. So we're back at where we've just heard outstanding issues be. The issue of senior appointments obviously has been an issue in terms of the monopoly of senior posts at the UN, which has been integrated in these discussions on the next SG timeline, deadlines, but also the missing link, as we called it at the time, which was a missing link in terms of this process between the Security Council and the GA after the straw polls that had been made. So there was a need or a wish for, again, this GA straw polls, which has come up now, to actually take the temperature of the GA on these candidates after having held the hearings. At the time, we tried to see what we could do regarding that, but there was obviously no such mandate at the time for the PGA, and it would be seen as a major overreach to start organizing either straw polls or any type of polling on the candidates from a GA point of view, so we were not able to move more on that. There was also the issue of withdrawal of candidates, which I understand has been codified since, but which was actually made through process, since we had issues, or we had candidates who did withdraw. We also had the issue of one member state having two candidates, where there actually is practice, and I understand it's been closed in the subsequent process through the GA revitalization resolution. And we had a lot of discussions on who can nominate, which came up when Fernando was in PGA's office and I was in the council, when we had the issue of non-member state candidates coming up from civil society. We discussed that quite a bit at the time when shaping the first process, and we had a very clear reading of the joint letter being a letter to member states soliciting candidates, and thus reading that it was member states who could nominate. And obviously this was later codified through GA revitalization. And then there were discussions on having a search committee in terms of civil society also participating more in nominating candidates that member states at the end could do, but that you could have search committees actually looking for candidates. And then the last point to make is the actual appointment resolution after the recommendation is made from the council to the GA, which was during the 71st session, and Peter Thompson's PGA, which was also became a very big process, and I expect it to be this year around as well. There were calls for intergovernmental negotiations for this, that there should be appointed co-facilitators to actually facilitate a resolution for the appointment. Since all past practice had only been the sort of rubber stamping with one sentence of appointment, there were a lot of discussions that this should be negotiated early on before we actually knew who the SG would be, so it wouldn't be prejudiced to whoever the candidate was. And this was seen as a way of also rebalancing the power between the GA and the council, that it came back to the GA and that it was actually the GA who appoints. And also there were calls not only referring to Article 97 of the Charter, but the rules of procedure and Rule 141, which actually says that the actual appointment should happen with a vote by secret ballot in a private meeting. So we had a lot of discussions about the merits of the practice that has been since Kurt Waldheim in terms of appointing the Secretary General through acclamation and consensus, and what that would mean for a new SG to be sort of appointed by acclamation versus by a secret ballot. In the end, the PGA took the decision to make this into a presidential text. We wrote the text, we consulted with groups and member states. We changed the appointment text from the one-liner that had been in previous years to actually have some substantive context in terms of welcoming the historic new selection process, saying that it had been guided by the principles of transparency and inclusivity, and we had a specific reference to Chapter 15 of the Charter, which was personally very important because it contains many important articles pertaining to the SG's role, powers and independence, and it also includes language upon recruitment of staff. So that was a way to actually encompass many of the sentiments without going into a broad intergovernmental process of negotiating the appointment resolution. In the end, I think that was a good thing to do because we were able to conclude it in a timely manner, and it carried through the principles of transparency and inclusivity from the very start of the process until the last end of appointment.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you for highlighting the duality, of some of the things that you got from revitalizations and some of the things that came out of PGA leadership and how you work with the membership to make that happen and into reality. I think that's something that we've seen coming again and again. So it's great to see where this new process started and how the GA and PGA had a role on shaping it up. But what happened on the council, right? Like how the council reacted to this push of transparency and how the process was carried out in 2016 and yeah, what lessons you have from that time when the things started to shift.
Thank you. I wanted to say up front, because this has been mentioned several times, that we're talking first and foremost about the member states. We're talking about a role for civil society. And I'd like to mention here that there is a third and very important constituency, and that is UN staff. And arguably, they will be most impacted by the next Secretary General. Also, they know a lot about the candidates who've been in the UN system. They know what their needs are for leadership internally, and as you all know, the staff are under tremendous stress right now with the liquidity changes which are impacting every single office. So to the extent that this discussion is designed to be proactive, I encourage every member state and civil society to go to the staff that you know and talk to them. I'm going to pick up two other points just in case I run out of time, and please tell me if I should stop. One is about the cutoff for nominations. First of all, I think there's a certain eagerness among candidates that the serious ones will not want to come in late. I also think that they will not ever want to be seen as coming through the back door and going straight to the Security Council and not going through the hearings in the General Assembly. That is their chance to create a big profile. And once they have that profile, it will be harder for the Security Council to ignore them. So they see it, I think, as a big opportunity. And I think the idea of a closing of the nominations, there's hesitancy on the part of the council because of past experience. We would not have had Dag Hammarskjöld as a Secretary General if there had been a close-off with the original group of candidates. It's important, which can easily happen, that you have some of the members absolutely not accepting one strong candidate, other members not accepting another strong candidate. You will need to look again to see if there's a viable candidate. And the other thing I wanted to say was with the letter, there is a little bit of hesitancy on the part of the Security Council. I don't think you can say that what they left out of the letter, although it definitely was highlighted by the President of the General Assembly, necessarily means opposition by the Council, but that the Council is holding back from endorsing certain activities by the General Assembly as the Council. I think there's still a sense that each body has to have the authority over its own processes, and that the Council will certainly want to carry forward its part of the process and leaves to the General Assembly, of which we have to remember all the Council members are a part, to carry out the hearings and the interactions of the President with the Security Council. So one final point is that it's a little bit a different balance as concerns the joint letter. The President of the General Assembly is elected, and so that carries for the President a fair amount of authority to act on their own. The President of the Security Council rotates in a technical way, alphabetically. And for that reason, the President can't simply negotiate a good letter and sign it. Anything that is not voted as a resolution has to be agreed by full consensus, which actually gives each of the 15 members the equivalent of veto. And so that has something to say about why the negotiations were more difficult on the Security Council side. And I'm very glad to Madam Ambassador for mentioning the P4+1, because sometimes it is hard to get the last P5 to agree to certain advances. So in terms of how did the Council respond, we've mentioned the role of civil society. There was particularly UNA UK, I think we need to give them credit, really mobilized for 2005-2006 and started talking to a lot of members they knew would be interested. And so I think the Security Council members knew by 2015 that there was a lot of momentum and that they would probably want to go along with that rather than being seen as obstructionists. So they did, I think, embrace a lot of what was in the 2015 revitalization resolution. They did take to heart the idea that there would be formally nominated candidates, that there would be written materials relating to those candidates, that those candidates would have the opportunity to present themselves. And I don't think it was a huge stretch, because as the years were going by, more was being known about the candidates. So it wasn't as though it had been completely closed by that time. I think they paid attention to the informal hearings in the General Assembly, and they did agree to publish at least a timeline for the start of their process. End of July was a generous deadline. That's the same deadline you see in the present letter, but it was to make a commitment. So I thought that that was a positive response. And then I think as the hearings began, there had always been candidates who tried to go to the individual Security Council members and talk to them and make their case. Their governments often did. But I think the Council got the idea that something was coming out from these conversations, and that led to them first, kind of in an ad hoc way, meeting eventually with the individual candidates. And I feel that that was impactful. I want to be clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Security Council. They would have to speak for themselves. But I think going into the 2016 process, there was no sense that there was a clear front runner. And I think they very much took to heart what they heard. And I think that Antonio Guterres especially was not seen, owing to his regional group, as a front runner. So members will tell you that they certainly were impressed by him in private, how he addressed the questions and the breadth of his knowledge. We can't say that was totally decisive, but I think it's fair to say that it had an impact. Now, what was left out, and rightfully so, from the revitalization resolution was how the council would proceed with its selection process, and it did continue with the straw polls, which had started in 1981, and they made one innovation, but it was really not related to what was decided in the GA. There's some very good amateur detectives in the Security Council, and when all of the candidates were on the same ballot, some of them tried to piece together by the patterns of which member was voting for whom, and so they decided it was a bit cumbersome that they would do an individual ballot for each candidate, and that way you didn't have that giveaway. It was cumbersome because there were 13 candidates at one point. There is an important resource for anyone really interested in the council side of this process, and that's what we call the Besho letter. It was written by Ambassador Besho of Japan, who served as council president in July 2016 when the straw polls began, and the symbol for that is S 2017-93. He set out a very good record of everything that happened. He flagged where the problem areas were, and he made recommendations. I think everyone would agree. Everyone would agree that the biggest problem area is the one that Mina raised, that the Security Council President was not authorized by the Council to convey officially the results of each round of straw polls. And obviously there was rebellion among some council members because of the leaks, in one case which were erroneous, which happened pretty instantaneously. And the President of the General Assembly, Vikatoft, actually put in writing that it was disrespectful. But this is where the P4+1 came in. 14 members felt very strongly that the President should announce the results of each straw polls, but it was blocked by one P5. The question is, how will that come up this year? We have a different sort of cast of characters now. We have different, that was an Obama administration. We now have a Trump administration. We've had a change of the ambassador from the Russian Federation. You have different candidates. You have different perspectives. You have a different organization. Will that one council member still insist on not announcing the results? We don't know. I have found by observing the P5 that just telling them that that's what you should do doesn't often carry weight, but that a good approach is to just lay out the advantages and disadvantages of a certain approach. Now, Ambassador Besho, in his letter, explained the three reasons that were given. First of all, that it was consistent with past practice. The council had never before officially announced the results of its straw polls. It had at one point announced the results of its votes when they were first using resolutions, but not the straw polls. Second, the not agreeing council member said that since the end product would be a resolution, the council had no practice for announcing publicly the stages of getting to a resolution before its adoption. So that would be a change of practice as well. And then there was the third argument that Mina mentioned, that it would be hurtful to a candidate to have it announced that they had performed poorly. On that latter point, I think it's fair to say that any candidate who is suitable for the role of Secretary General has to be prepared for public embarrassment. This comes with the role, so I think every candidate should be prepared to know. Hopefully they would have a good tally, but if they don't, for that to be made public. And the argument that the other council members made is, since it's going to come out anyway, better to have it be official. So they revisited it several times. Could we now announce the results publicly because they are being leaked, but that one member stayed firm. In order for you to get some other questions, let me pass it back to you.
Thank you, Lorraine. And just to follow up on this, I think that's a question that we receive all the time, is to explain how the relation between the veto P5 and the straw poll work. Can you explain how the color code comes to play a game at some point?
Yeah, this developed after you could go through endless rounds of straw polls and see that a candidate was polling very strongly in terms of numbers. But you could have one P5 who just said absolutely not. If you go back to when Waldheim was seeking a third term, that was when they were voting on resolutions, and China vetoed Waldheim by report 16 times. So they really were not going to accept him for a third term. So the idea was, when the members just wanted to know, do we have a valid candidate or do we need to look at some of the others, they introduced the red ballots, not right away, but for the P5. So you could see that even if candidate had 13, they don't vote for, against. It's encourages, discourages, and no opinion, which is also telling, because a permanent member or an elected member could discourage a certain candidate, but ultimately, if they see that that candidate has support or they learn more about the candidate, they could come around. Whereas under the veto system, it seemed like a flat rejection. And the other thing with the veto system was that a permanent member might not yet be ready to commit, but if they thought there was a candidate having support and they merely abstained, that candidate could be close to going through. So sometimes they would cast a preemptive veto, just to say, we want to stop the process here while we take account what the total vote is, then we'll decide whether we could accept this candidate or not. So for the elected members, I know this year they would like to see an elimination of the red ballots on principle, but I think what we saw in 2016 was they were used responsibly. There were 5 rounds of straw polls, and then when the numbers were there and it seemed like Antonio Gutierrez was a go-ahead, then they introduced the red ballots just to see that there were no vetoes pending. That became clear, and then they went ahead to the step of resolution.
Thank you. And I'm very conscious of the time, and I think like a lot of the questions that I have, you were addressing in different moments. Just to bring you quickly to 2021, when there was a reappointment, because I think something that when we go back to history, we see that there were some key reforms introduced in the reform. There was a role for PGA to build on top of that. There was a role for the council to engage with the PGA and to also build on that. And the same we saw in 2021. Like now, when we see backwards, that, oh yeah, of course, Gutierrez was running for a second term. There was no question asked. But it was not so clear. I was a PGA at the time, still some PTSD about the timing. Like Gutierrez only came publicly that he was running for a second term early on 2021. Like on 2020, there was no confirmation. PGA was bound by the resolution from the 69 session. There were a lot of monthly conversation with the council, like when is PGA, should we launch a process, or should we have a joint letter to open for a process? At the end, what happened, and this is public because you can find it online, like the PGA decided to write to the SG, so tell us if you want to run or not. The SG answered back, say, yeah, I'm going to present myself for a second term. But he also did on that letter, he said, I'm going to present a new vision statement and I'm going to attend on a hearing, confirming that those reforms that were introduced in 2015 were valid even for the reappointment process. And that's not and again, those technicalities show how practice make the process, and not necessarily the law make the process. And the law is actually codifying what progress would have been finding on the past. And just, again, for the records, there were no, the resolution before the year of Gutierrez decided to run for a second term, the revitalization resolution was very short because it was on the middle of COVID. On the 74th session, that was when supposed that the member state decide how the issue of a reappointment of an incumbent will be decided, and there was no negotiation because we were in the middle of COVID. So it was all beat up again by PGA in continuous discussion with the Security Council, always guided by this principle of transparency and inclusivity on the process. And there is a lot of things that I think that we would like to go in depth, like, you know, as you mentioned, the different nature of the role of the President of the Council and the role of the President of the General Assembly, the role of the rest of the membership to endorse and support the PGA to go in a specific direction when it comes to innovations in the process. You know, again, we are really running behind time, but maybe one last word on what you expect this year. What would be the opportunities for the community to engage, any innovation that you would like to highlight before concluding this discussion?
Okay. Lorraine, you have the last word because you will be the wisest, but as always. But just to reinforce, I think, your point, Fernando, about the 2021 process, because we were very cognizant then not to do no harm. That was our entry point. We were, as an elected member in the Security Council, very cognizant of maintaining the gains that were made in 2015-16 for this process in 2026. So our worry was to erase the precedent that had been set by, you know, inadvertently doing things another way. And it was very helpful that the incumbent SG actually reinforced the process by saying that he would take part in the process. And as a footnote to the first process, I would say that I completely agree with Lorraine. When Antonio Guterres came into the race, nobody thought he was the guy that we were looking for. And I think it was even said by some Security Council ambassadors that this is not the guy we're looking for. Because of expectations of, you know, gender, regional rotation, etc. And the process enforced and made him the front runner because of the process. And in fact, on the day of his appointment in the GA, when we had a meeting with him behind in GA 200, he said that it's because of this process that I'm here. So that, of course, made us, all of us, happy that it actually did have an impact. But I think the 21 process was important in order to reinforce the precedent that had been set. I'd also like to echo what Lorraine said about the latecomers. I mean, as the ACT country, we have a position in terms of the deadlines, but personally, I do have to say that having shaped that process, it was extremely important because we knew there would probably, or they could be latecomers. And the most important part about that was not to have a strict deadline, but actually to make sure that those latecomers took part in the full process. And so you could foresee a Kofi Annan example of a candidate coming out of the hat in December, the year that you needed to make the appointment, and we still wanted to be ready to organize an informal dialogue with the GA in order for them to have a hearing with that candidate. So I think that's maybe my last words on that. And 2021 was important to maintain the gains that had been made. And obviously there have been incremental gains made in all of the GA revitalization resolutions since, such as addressing the issue of self-nominations, member states making nominations, civil society participation, the issue of explicitly saying that there has yet not been a woman SG and encouraging states. And these are some of the things I think will be up for discussion this year. How do we, as member states, heed the call for putting forward women candidates? Will we make progress in terms of transparency in the straw polls? Will we make progress in terms of having the informal dialogue improved even further and civil society participation being guaranteed? I think those are important points to keep in mind as we embark on the rest of this process.
I think Ambassador Tomsar raises an important point about the validity of regional rotation. And having departed from it in 2016, I think there's going to be a lot of attention this time. Is that going to be respected or not? There's quite a history to regional rotation, as members know, this has come up, that it's not just with respect to the Secretary General, but the President of the General Assembly, the positions on the Security Council, and so will it be seen within the organization as an important criterion? But how would that appear outside the organization if there's sort of a crowd favorite who's not from one of the two regions which are underrepresented or not represented at all in the case of Eastern Europe in the role? So that's one concern, I think, for member states. The second, we do have very mobilized public opinion right now towards a female Secretary General. And I think all of us are holding our breath on that because it has to be the right woman. I think we want that woman to have the leadership qualities that will make people see that this is an appropriate position for a woman. My one concern is that there is the public face to this process, which are the hearings, which will be webcast and I think attract a lot of public attention. And someone may perform very well in that public space. But then as the member states get to know the candidates, they may start lining up behind maybe a quieter candidate, maybe slightly less charismatic, but one that they think can really do the job. And my concern is that this might be a disappointment to the public. And so this brings us back to the process. I think what was launched in 2015, 2016, as both of you have confirmed, was consolidated in 2021, is now the gold standard for this. And I think members have been through one competitive process with it. They know how it works. They have confidence in it. And I would just say that members, I think, would do well to make sure that every step of it, of the process, appears credible. This will give a good launch to the next Secretary General. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both, for your reflections and information. I think we could go for hours, but unfortunately we can't. So back to Thibaut for taking us to the closing section.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you, Mina and Lauren, for this discussion. To conclude our session, I would now like to invite Ms. Karen Langdon. Karen is a distinguished fellow at NYU Center, the Center on International Cooperation. Her career spans decades of UN service. She was formerly UN Executive Director of the Security Council Report and previously led 3 UN peace operations in Liberia, Burundi, and Nepal, including heading the mission in Liberia during the 2014 Ebola crisis. Before that, she worked for over 20 years with refugees through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and also served as the first Chief of Child Protection at UNICEF. Thank you, Karen, and thank you for concluding this discussion.
I better hold it because I'm quite soft-spoken. It's been so encouraging to know that this discussion attracted a standing room only crowd. And now I have every incentive to be very brief, and I will be. My first point is that although July does not seem to be close, the 6-7 months until then are really not a long time to do all the organizing that is going to be necessary. How to use these 6 months, 7 months most effectively, collectively. I want to go through the main suggestions we've heard at this meeting because there have been some very good ones and they should not get lost. Go ahead right now and schedule the GA hearings. Consider additional hearings after those hearings. I think that's a brand new suggestion. Work on a better format for these dialogues. That is going to need a lot of unpacking. I think it's safe to say that 9 years ago, the dialogues got a rather rote quality, and certainly all those being questioned knew exactly the questions they were going to get, I think. So what would a better format and maybe better content actually look like? Town halls with civil society, really important. And I'm glad we were reminded of the critical role civil society played in getting these radical reforms in place coming up to 10 years ago. Insist harder on the regional rotation of the Secretary General. Now, that is going to need some heavy lifting by that region because, as we know, 9 years ago, that was let go, that was lost in effect. And I think the point was made that it could be lost for good now if it's not sustained this time around. Work out how you understand the requirements. It's all very well to say the highest standards, etc. What is behind the language of highest standard? What does highest standard look like? And I would add, speaking for myself, are there any red flags? We don't have red flags in the GA resolution, but think about what they would be, I suggest. Ambassador Giorgini suggested reviewing the elements paper and the zero draft of the GA resolution, the things that wound up on the cutting room floor but are still important. Encourage the PGA to the maximum, use paragraph G. Involve and invite the P5 to discussions that are not their own around the selection process. I think this is one way for them to feel the strength of sentiment around not only some processes being followed, but possibly around the candidates. Secure active civil society engagement, including the UNAs, UNA UK in particular was mentioned. Take the temperature of the GA after the hearings. This was something you commented on, Mina. And finally, remember you are not limited by what is mandated and what was done before. There is space to do more, to do something differently. And again, this is going to have to come up from the PGA, from civil society, from extremely engaged member states. Sustaining this over the next 6 months, 7 months, consultatively and transparently is hugely important. The GA is the most effective check on the closed process of selection that one can suspect the P5 would probably still prefer to have. And what is done now is going to be the template for 2031. So best of luck in this process, and thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today, and allow me to just thank our participants for this very insightful pieces of information. Sorry if we went a little longer. As you can imagine, there's always a lot of elements to unpack. There will be more of this, so I invite you to just follow us on social media or our publications, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you very much, everyone.